Welcome to the Mormon Expositor podcast. This is Heather, and today's episode is the final installment of the Advice for Interacting with Apostates series. As you may recall from the previous episodes, this discussion was intended to be one episode, so I repeatedly refer during the conversation to segments. So please don't be confused by that. Also, in the second half of the episode, my friend Elisa gave advice based on the status of her relationship with her family at the time. But I'm very happy to report that things have gotten better with her family since we recorded, and so she wanted me to let everybody know that, and to say that given that things have improved with her family, she might have different advice than she gave in the episode. Hopefully, if she listens to this, because it's been so long since we recorded it, and she has anything that she would like to amend or add upon, she will be able to do so in the comments. Thanks. In this segment of today's episode, I am joined by, of course, Amber. She's going to be sticking with us through every segment, as well as a friend, Kim. She was on an episode of Voices in which she and some friends discussed dealing with inner city kids in the church. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
So in this segment, we are going to talk about interacting with just your average everyday ward member and sharing some experiences that we've had with them and giving advice for how we, as apostates, and I'm not exactly sure, Kim, where you could consider yourself on that spectrum.
Oh, I'm apostate.
You're apostate. Okay. So what we as apostates believe or advice we would give regarding how to productively interact with the inactive as well as those who are outright calling themselves apostate. Because there are differences. You've got some people who are just inactive, and then you've got some people who are like, no, I'm not doing that anymore. Actually don't believe it. We're apostates. So does anybody have any stories they'd like to start off with?
I can start off with just a really simple one.
Okay.
And it goes along with like giving advice, and part of the advice is know your audience. So I am not a hugger. It's just not something I grew up with. I'm really uncomfortable with it. It's really awkward for me. And so when I see people from the ward and there's hugs that are forced on me, I know it's coming from a very kind place, but it's just really awkward for me. So knowing who your audience is and knowing what their personalities are like, I think is one of the very first recommendations for ward members.
And maybe if you're not entirely familiar with that person, try to read their cues. And if they're not acting like they want you to hug them, don't offer one.
Or don't force it.
Yeah.
Or ask. Like, I am a hugger. But when I meet somebody that I don't know, I'm usually like, I'm kind of a hugger. Is that okay? And if they're like, then I'm like, it's fine. We can shake hands. That's a general life skill, I think, right there. But
yeah, definitely.
Well, I think it goes to also that it just, I think in the church, sometimes we're raised without some personal boundaries. Mm-hmm. And so that can play out where people just don't even think that they need to ask beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Definitely.
When boundaries are laid out, respect those boundaries. Don't think that you know better or they don't know what they're saying. One thing I appreciate is that when I quit attending, I spoke to my Relief Society president at the time, she was also my friend, because I wanted to tell her, I was like, this is what has happened, and I'm no longer coming or attending because I do not believe this anymore. Like, I was very blunt with her, and she said, do you still want to have a visiting teacher? And I said, no, I do not want to be a visiting teacher, and I do not want to have visiting teachers. And she's like, okay, and it was never an issue. I've never had visiting teachers show up at my door.
And I would agree with that. Like, I think that goes along with the advice of just like respect requests, like those personal boundaries or requests that have been made. And I have this similar situation that the Relief Society president in my husband's ward is a friend and somebody I really like a lot. And she has respected that. Now, I don't know what happens when things will change and leadership shifts over, if I need to make that request again, or if that gets passed on from leader to leader. But yeah, respect the requests that are made.
The majority of the experience that I have with this particular issue was when I was an active believer in college. The church was very painful for me growing up, and especially when I was in college. But I still believed, so I would go through these phases where I would try to attend. And I would go to church for like, say, a 3-month stretch every Sunday. And every Sunday, people would introduce themselves to me as if I had never been there before. For 3 months, after 3 months, of being there. Or I would get calls by the family home evening group leader to come to family home evening. And then when I would show up, they'd have no idea who I was. So the majority of the experience I have interacting with ward members was basically being treated like a project, not actually having people interested in getting to know me. Just they had something they were supposed to do. They have that little get into heaven checklist, and fellowship, the less active, is on that list. And so they do that without really putting any thought into it.
Or any depth to it. And I think that's don't be fake. That would be my other advice. Don't be the guy who says, I'm your new home teacher, and I'm going to show up once a month with a plate of cookies that my wife made for me on the 30th of the month, and check you off my list, because it comes across as fake. And in the same vein, like, if you weren't my friend before I stopped going to church, when you show up because you've missed me, you can smell that a mile away.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've heard you say before when we were talking about doing this episode, don't go to people and say, oh, I've missed you, if you make absolutely no effort to interact with them in real life. And all you really mean is just come to church.
Yeah.
That is my least favorite way that people, like, I'm shopping at the local Smith's and I run into somebody that used to talk to me all the time because we were both called to nursery together. And, since I've stopped going to church, I have never seen or talked to them again, which isn't the problem. The problem isn't that we no longer speak, because, like, a lot of those relationships at church are very casual. They're not deep relationships. But don't pretend like it was. Mm-hmm. Don't come up to me and be like, oh, Amber, I've missed you so much. Because my honest response, and it's not a very nice one, but I get tired of hearing it, is, well, I haven't moved, and my phone number's the same, and you unfriended me on Facebook.
Right?
Maybe that's why.
Yeah.
But I'm a jerk, so that might not work well. But, like, that's kind of how it comes across is, not only have you not made an effort, you've made an un-effort by disconnecting your contact with me. Don't tell me you've missed me when what you mean is, I haven't seen you at church in 2.5 years.
Right.
Or just say that. Like, say, I've missed seeing you at church.
Yeah. And I understand that they have good intentions, but it's still, like, the whole reason for this podcast is to get people to think about what they do when they interact with apostates, and maybe how it's not coming across as they think it's coming across, or it's not as effective as the church tells them it would be, I guess.
Right. Well, and I think also there's an element of honesty, too. If you say you've missed me, it comes across as dishonest, because no, you don't. But if you say, I've missed seeing you at church, there's that, acknowledgement of, I've missed seeing you at church because that's where we used to interact. It's kind of like if I saw somebody that I used to be in book club with, and they say, I've missed seeing you at book club. That wouldn't hurt my feelings either, because I don't go to book club anymore. Like, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, I miss that monthly interaction we had. Even though we never saw each other out of that, we were still, at least acquaintances because of it, and I missed that.
Yeah.
That comes across as genuine.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, too, there's the element of fear of saying the wrong thing because they don't want to hurt the apostate's feelings, because then they'll even more be likely not to come back to church, right? Like, that's there.
It definitely is there, because I have a feeling that most believers who don't think about inactivity or apostasy really, I think they just probably tacitly accept the idea that the reason people aren't coming to church is that they're angry about something, or they've, quote, been offended. So yeah, they're definitely like, I've got to make them feel welcome. I've got to make them feel like they should come back, that type of a thing. And it probably does make them behave in a way that they wouldn't if they were dealing with someone who was never a Mormon, that was never in their ward or whatever.
And I think there's a lot of pressure on them for that reason. But I do think it's important. Another advice I would have for them is to realize that there's a lot of very specific Mormon language that for a lot of people who've left the church, that language comes with baggage. You do need to choose your words wisely, but only knowing your audience. It wouldn't matter to me, but somebody else knowing that person and understanding why they left may help you know what kind of interaction is going to be the most beneficial for them.
Right. So don't go into any interaction.
I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it makes total sense. I think basically you shouldn't be assuming information about the person you're interacting with.
And don't base your assumptions on why they do or don't come to church on rumors you've heard from people going around the ward.
So have either of you had horror stories of ward members trying to reactivate you or anything?
No, because in my situation, my husband is still very active. And so I think he's a buffer for me
Mm-hmm.
and kind of like steers those off before they happen.
Is your husband still active, Amber?
No, he hasn't gone in over a year either. He's no longer active. And neither are my children. I have children that are old enough if they wanted to be active on their own, they could. And they're not active either. We've had a couple of incidents. Like the assumption is I don't go to church because my feelings got hurt because I have lousy neighbors, which isn't the case. The neighbors who were lousy for years before I stopped going to church. Like, it's not their fault or their responsibility. But I think that there is some guilt that they carry because of that. So they're kind of the ones that send me conference talks. And when I respond in a very direct way, they don't really like that. We had a home teacher come by. This was like 3 months ago. Because there was like radio silence for a long time. But the last like 3 or 4 months, it's like we've popped up again on their radar on the Family 5 list or whatever. We had a home teacher come by who we didn't know, which I think is not fair of the ward to do that, actually. Like, he doesn't know us because he moved in after we've been attending. So he called our house to see if he could come over and home teach. And my husband answered the phone, and he said, "We're not interested in having home teachers." And kind of hung up on him abruptly because he wouldn't stop talking. And then he came by on a Friday morning and nobody was home but me. He came by and he knocked on the door and I answered the door and I didn't know who he was. And he introduced himself and said, "I'm your home teacher." And I said, "Oh, yeah, we're not interested in home teachers, but thank you." And he's like, "Yeah, that's what your husband said." I'm like, "Then why are you here?" Like, you've been told that we're not interested on the phone. That doesn't mean you show up on my front porch unannounced. Which I think is one of the rules that I would lay out, is that if you want to come by for an official church visit, make an appointment and make sure that visit is wanted.
Yes.
I used to do the same thing as a visiting teacher. I would ambush people because they would like flake out on appointments or not answer the phone. And I think it's something that's almost taught to do. Like, if you were coming to my house to talk about, Amway, you would expect to make an appointment, not just show up, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same with the church. It's the same with the church, especially when I've chosen not to attend. So he shows up on my front porch, and I tell him I'm not interested in home teaching. And he's like, "That's okay. We don't have to talk about the church." And he said, "I'm not the kind of guy who likes to give lessons and talk about the church." And I said, "Well, I actually really enjoy talking about the church. I think it's really fun. But usually when I talk to people like you about the church, it makes them very uncomfortable and makes them upset." And I said, "So that doesn't bother me." I said, "But you came to my house unannounced after we told we were interested. That bothers me." He's like, "I don't know a whole lot about the church. Like, when I give lessons in Elders Quorum, I'll be like, I don't really understand why I should have a testimony of this. So why don't you tell me what you should think?" He's like, "That's how I present church lessons." And I said, "Well, if you came to my house and said that, I would tell you all the reasons why you're correct not to have a testimony of that. So this is probably not a good idea for you." And then he said, "Well, I grew up in a house a lot like yours. My father was an alcoholic and he drank all the time. I was really angry and mad. And my mom was always upset. And so the only place I found comfort and refuge was at church." And I'm like, "You just said that my children are uncomfortable in my home because my husband is an alcoholic and I'm mean and you don't know us." And I don't think he heard that, but that's what he said. When he said, "I grew up in a house just like yours." All he knows is that we don't go to church on Sunday. Mm-hmm. So I guess don't make assumptions. Don't show up without an appointment. Know your audience, know your audience, know your audience. And if you want to have a conversation, be willing to have a conversation. I would never dream of going and knocking on somebody's door I don't know, bringing them a plate of cookies thinking that invites me in and saying, "I just want to sit down and talk to your children about atheism for a little bit. Have you read Richard Dawkins? Okay, let's read this chapter together and discuss what it means." Like, I would never fathom doing that to anyone.
Well, Amber, I think there's also a really important one that you just gave a good example of. When someone says no, take no as the answer.
Yes, and take them at their word.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
the lessons that's taught is if you can just get your foot in the door and get them to feel the Spirit, whether they want to or not, then they'll come back to church.
I think that might be part of why people are treated as projects when someone wants to do reactivation work or feels that they're supposed to for their little heaven checklist. They've been taught what they are supposed to do is provide a conduit for the person to feel the Spirit. So that's all they're really invested in doing. They don't really go to that person's house with the interest of making a friend or getting to know somebody. And it's not the same for everybody. I've had a visiting teacher here in Salt Lake City who's been very friendly and who has invited me to like go out to dinner with her and her friends, go on a walk. Very genuinely nice. But I think it is kind of a spectrum in that some people, they don't go past, well, I've done my job trying to get them to come back. I gave them the opportunity to feel the Spirit, so I don't need to do anymore. And honestly, they don't want to do anymore, right? I mean, we've been believers. And we know, like, the obligations we're supposed to fill that we don't want to fill, so we try to do it and we don't really have our heart in it. I don't want to give the impression that we are angry at those who approach us for reactivation or whatever. Some people are so fed up with the church that they are annoyed and angry with people who show up on their doorstep and they want to be left alone, which is why it's a good thing to give the advice that if they tell you no and to go away, listen to them. But it's hard to get across to believers that we just don't believe it anymore, or we just don't care anymore. And so it creates uncomfortable situations. And so that kind of, I'm trying to lead into a piece of advice that I would give, which is you need to know yourself as well. I know that if a believer listens to this, they're going to say, well, nothing anybody could say would ever shake my testimony. But if you go into a situation where you intentionally think, I want to get to know this person, I want to know why they left, especially if you were friends with them when they were active in the church, if you go to their home and you ask to genuinely understand why they left the church, don't freak out when they start telling you why.
And don't be defensive.
Yeah, if you know that you're going to get that deer in the headlights, panicked, rushing pulse reaction to what they tell you, just don't bother.
Right. Well, and I guess I have a good story to tell, too. I have a friend from college who, you know, by point of deduction, you can tell on Facebook I don't go to church anymore. And she asked me why. And I told her, I said, well, it's a really long story, so if you really want to know, we can talk on the phone, but most people really don't want to know the answer. And she actually called me, and we had like a 4-hour conversation. She just listened most of the time. Mm-hmm. She didn't try and tell me I was wrong. She never bore her testimony once. She is still a believer who still goes to church. But she just, because we are friends, she wanted to know. Mm-hmm. And I told her, and it was fine.
Right.
You know, and I think that is the biggest key is to not jump in with testimony bearing when you feel the slightest bit of discomfort. And if you ask a question, make sure you want to hear the answer.
Mm-hmm. In contrast to the story that you just told, after the elections, Amy wanted to go to church to see what kind of crazy stuff would be said about Mitt Romney losing. And unfortunately, we live in the Avenues, so the ward is a tiny bit more liberal than the average ward, so nothing was said about it. She was a little disappointed about that, but she happened to meet the two gals who have been my visiting teachers and who have occasionally brought me cookies and that kind of a thing. And they were so excited. Within an hour and a half of church being over, they were at her doorstep. She had only told them her first name, so she has no idea how they found out where she lives and all this stuff. She must be on the church roll, but whatever. They show up at her door, and I happened to be over there because we were going to do some podcast stuff. And they were asking us what we thought about church that day, and the instructor of the Sunday school had said some really nasty things, and so Amy was being honest about it. And they got deer in the headlights, shaking, panicky reaction mode going, and I felt bad for them. It was a completely unproductive interaction. They tried to bear their testimony, and that didn't really work either. And I don't necessarily have a problem with people bearing their testimony, but I did write it down on my list of advice of what not to do, simply because it just doesn't work. It's not persuasive.
And when it depends on how it's used, because a lot of times when it's been done for me, it feels really patronizing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to stop the conversation.
Yeah, like to shut me down. And then there's other times where it's been done, I guess because it's been done by somebody who's a close friend, so I know them in a much more global way. And then it's done in a way that's respectful and just sharing of what their beliefs are. Like I've just shared what I believe and they're sharing what they believe. And that feels different than somebody who doesn't know me and is kind of ending the conversation by bearing their testimony. It has this feeling of patronizing to me.
I agree. It's a conversation stopper. Unless it's presented in the way that Kim was just describing, where you're actually having a genuine interaction with somebody and you're open to what they're saying and they're open to what you're saying.
But I think that that's the difference, is that the genuine conversation part doesn't happen often. I had an interaction with one of my neighbors who sent me a text with Jeffrey Holland's talk from the conference in the spring and said, I think you should listen to this. And this started this long texting conversation. And I told her, I said, you do not want to have this conversation with me at all. And she's like, well, I'm interested to know where you stand. And I said, I don't think you are. And then 4 hours later, the conversation ended with, this conversation is doing me no good. I don't want to talk about this anymore. I listened to the talk before you sent it to me, and I have some things to say about it. So if you want to hear what I think about it, then you need to listen. And you can tell me why you agree or disagree with that. But instead, the defenses go up, and then they just get upset, and they don't want to see your point of view, and they don't want to share anything other than their testimony. Not a conversation, it's a teaching moment. And if you don't accept the teaching moment, then you're the angry bad person.
I have one that I think kind of is advice to both members as well as apostates. This summer I had several opportunities to have good conversations with my siblings, and the conversations were never me sharing my beliefs, but it was a time for them to share personal experiences going on with them that happened to be about church, but it wasn't sharing to reconvert me, and it was just sharing a part of their life that's important to them. I guess my advice is, if you had a relationship with a person who's gone apostate, that doesn't mean you can't share those things with them anymore that's important to you as a person. But don't expect, I don't know, I don't know exactly what I want to say, but I feel like sometimes apostates that I spend time with tend to want to get defensive and show, like, put a mirror up to members when all the members trying to do is share a genuine experience. They're not trying to reconvert you. So also, I guess it's taking those moments and allowing them to be just a personal sharing moment can still be really powerful for maintaining relationships. Does that make sense?
I think it makes sense. I think, we've told believers to assume good intentions or not assume bad things. And I think it's totally fair to tell apostates not to do the same thing. It's not fair to assume that somebody is trying to reactivate you just because they're sharing something with you, or they're using it in a manipulative way. They could just very genuinely be having a conversation with you, and that is something you should be open to as well, rather than having your knee-jerk reaction.
And I think a lot of that, again, goes back to our point of, like, know the person and know the relationship you had before apostasy happened. And so, I could go into those conversations with previous experience of sharing and the relationship. But I just remember having just this moment during the conversation going, I could bring up a lot of things here, but it would really ruin the moment. And it's not necessary. She's not in a place to hear what I have to say. So I'm just going to appreciate that she's sharing part of her life.
So is there anything else that you guys wanted to put on this list, or do you think we've covered everything?
I would emphasize the being real, not being fake.
And something that you kind of threw out there, but not explicitly, don't make assumptions, don't believe rumors, like you said, and don't make accusations. Like, I don't think that guy understood that he accused your husband of being an alcoholic, but don't accuse people of being suckered by anti-Mormon lies. Don't accuse them of wanting to sin, all that kind of stuff.
My last thing that I had was find, like, a meeting point that has nothing to do with church. Find other things that we can talk about that's not related to church. It's probably going to be the best way for us to maintain a relationship going forward.
Right.
Yes. Especially for a casual neighbor.
Yeah.
Or work them.
Have we given any positive advice? Do this rather than don't do that?
do be my friend. I think that's the biggest thing. Like, just because I don't go to church doesn't mean I won't be friends with Mormons. All of my relatives are Mormon. Like, I interact with Mormons on a daily basis. I still really like Mormon people a lot, actually. And I can be your friend even if I don't go to church on Sunday. Like, if you see me in the neighborhood, say hello, let your kids play with my kids, be genuine.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder on that note you wanted positive things, so it may sound a little negative, but this idea of ask yourself before you have the interaction with the apostate, why you're having the interaction. Are you having the interaction because you genuinely care about the person and you want to have a relationship going forward? Or are you having that interaction because you feel you're required to, or it's on something on your to-do list? Because if it's the first part and you genuinely want a relationship, then go ahead and have the conversation and don't fret over words, just be genuine. If it's the other two, then it might not be worth the interaction because it's not a helpful purpose.
But there are still going to be people who, if it is those latter reasons, they're still going to feel obligated to do it, or they're still going to want to do it.
Yeah.
And in those cases, I would say just low expectations, don't have a personal investment in how the person reacts, and respect what they tell you.
Yeah, and if they say no, then pass that information back to other ward members. Yeah.
And on the part of apostates, I think it's fair to us to be clear. If you're going to get annoyed on the 30th of the month, every month, when that visiting teacher or home teacher shows up, then you need to take the initiative and tell them directly, thank you for trying, I'm not interested. And I know it's annoying and it feels like a burden that it shouldn't, but call the Relief Society president or the Elders Quorum president and say, listen, I want to be taken off the route. I do not want home teachers or visiting teachers. Mm-hmm. And you can do it via email now. So you don't have to have that direct conflict, but make your expectations known before you get upset that they're not respecting the boundaries you haven't set.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I know that this isn't part of the segment, but I really want to give this advice is if you are someone who's in a mixed faith relationship like I am, and you have children that are being raised in the church, really make it clear to the leadership in letter form, in verbal form, in whatever form, just make it really clear what your expectations are around leadership and your children. For me, very specifically, that means that my children are never to be allowed to be alone with a leader doing an interview, that my husband or myself has to always be present. And I want to make sure they always clearly know that beforehand. So going along Amber's point of learning to be very assertive in your communication with the ward is going to go big distances to having a healthy relationship with any ward member that you see.
Definitely.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me for this segment. I appreciate your help.
You're welcome.
Yeah, sure.
All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us for the last segment of our episode, advice to believers about interacting with apostates. And for this segment, I have asked my very good friends, Chris and Elisa. Hello, guys.
Hi. Hello.
They are here to join Amber and myself in a discussion about family and advice to parents and siblings and cousins and just anybody in your family on how to positively interact with an apostate or a doubter, whatever category that person falls into, even just like a fringy liberal Mormon. Why don't we go ahead and just jump right in with sharing some personal experiences that have influenced the advice that you would have to give to family about interacting with apostates, maybe some fears that you had about what would happen with your extended families, some things that have happened, anything you feel comfortable sharing.
Well, one thing to start out with is, we stayed in the church a lot longer, despite not believing, purely for this reason alone, purely because we just didn't want to upset family members or have to, go through those, so we tried for a really long time to make the church work just so that we didn't have to have those confrontations with family members. Mm-hmm. My situation is a teeny bit different because, as some people might know, I used to be kind of fairly regularly involved with the Mormon Expression podcast, and I also kept a blog of my own. And then somebody ratted on me to my parents. They sent them some of the Mormon Expression episodes I was on, and they also sent a link to my blog. So my parents kind of found out about my apostasy in less than an ideal way, but
well, I think they found out more about the extent of your apostasy.
Yeah, they
You
knew
had
about
already-
it before then,
You
but
already talked to them before, but
they didn't see. They got to see the whole truth at that point. Like, they got to see how deep my apostasy was at that point. So that has changed the dynamics a little bit. But we should also mention your family, Chris, like how they've kind of had a very different approach to this.
Well, when I first told my family, it was a really hard conversation to have. I waited till they came to visit us. They live a few states away. They came to visit, and one night I just told them about the doubts that I was having, and I wanted to do that to kind of ease into the idea that I might not be with the church all the time from here on out. It was a really tough conversation to have, of course, but since that conversation, and we didn't talk much after that conversation, but since that conversation, we have been just trying to have good family relationships. So there was mostly just trying not to talk about that particular subject or bring it up or anything, and just try to focus on other things that we have in common or other things that are going on and that sort of thing.
So in general, I would describe the difference between our two families is Chris's family is very passive about it. They don't really talk about it. We don't deal with it when it comes to Chris's family. And my family is a lot more, we will talk about it all the time. And we deal, I have to deal with this kind of upfront, almost every conversation I have with them, almost every interaction I have with them. And so we have two very different family experiences when it comes to this. And I'll tell you which one I prefer. That's definitely Chris's family. We're just going to love you. We're going to treat you like nothing has happened and treat it like there's an elephant in the room. And that's a lot easier to handle than the constant battling over this issue.
Right.
That's interesting because I prefer, I guess not battling, I don't prefer battling, but that is an accepted part of conversation rather than pretending like nothing has changed. But then when you do something that is out of the LDS norm, then everybody gets their feelings hurt. Maybe his family doesn't do that, but mine certainly does, where it's like, we'll just pretend like nothing has changed. But the moment you leave the family reunion with the other evil heathens to go to a bar, then everyone's going to get their feelings hurt, even if it's done in the dead of night, just because they hear that it happened. But we're going to pretend like nothing changed.
Well, Chris's family is passive, but they're not passive aggressive, so maybe that makes a difference. There are some nice things about the head-on confrontations, but it gets really old after a while too. I get just really tired of it, like constantly battling.
It may come up in the future where we'll want to do something and it will directly conflict with something that they want us to do, but I don't think that's come up yet. So I don't know, maybe that's a battle we haven't had to fight yet.
Yep. So what would be your ideal scenario about what would happen or what your relationship with your family would be like?
So I've got kind of a list of 5 pieces of advice, and we can just kind of go through each one.
Yeah, that sounds great.
I think the first one is to be cautious about what you say about the apostate family members when they're not present. I'm not saying don't ever talk about it with other people, because I recognize that it's a very human need. When some family member has done something that upsets you, it's very human to want to talk about that. But I do think that when you do talk about the apostate family members, that you should be very cautious about who you talk to and how much you talk about them and how negatively you talk about them, because it can just go really wrong. Like, the situations that tend to bother me the most when I find out that other family members have been talking about me behind my back are when it's either not true, the things that they've been saying about me, like saying, oh, well, Elisa gets drunk every day, or last time I was with her, she was drunk, and which I'm like, wow, I have like maybe one drink a month, So it's really weird to have things that are not true about me said behind my back. That's pretty hurtful sometimes. Mm-hmm. And the other time that it's hurtful is when it's in a sort of a pseudo public forum, like an email that goes out to the extended family members or things like that, where I just hear after the fact that people have been talking negatively about me. So on one level, I recognize that it's human to need to talk about these issues, But there's good places and there's bad places and good situations to do that in, and, you know, places where it's not so helpful. So
just be cautious about it.
Yeah, sometimes good things come from it.
I've had a little bit of experience with that where my mother has kind of unloaded on me about my sister. And I think that the thing that you can never know, but the thing you need to know is that person has discretion, and also that person is not going to base everything they think about the individual you're talking about on what you say. Like, my mother can unload her frustrations on me, but I still have my own opinions of my sister. And I'm also not going to be running to my sister and say, well, listen to all the hurtful things that mom said, you know? So I definitely agree that if you're not incredibly careful, that instead of making a situation less stressful, you can make it worse, or you can make it harder to have harmonious family interactions.
It's important too. I know that there have been a couple instances in my family where everyone is there except for the person that's being discussed that we're all concerned about. And there's going to be a large family discussion about this person and their situation with the church. It happened before I left regarding another family member and her supposed inactivity, which turned out not to be true. And then it also happened, it's happened at least twice that I know of in my family, about me when I wasn't present. But if you have, 15 people in a room, at least one of them is going to come back to me and tell me what was said and what happened.
Yeah.
I would rather personally be approached directly and, what is going on? Can I help you? Especially when I've approached each of these family members and told them, I do not believe in the church anymore. I'm no longer attending, but really I'm fine. I'm good. Then to never have a discussion with them about the issue again, but know that they're all talking about it to each other without including me as part of the conversation.
Yeah, and that can just be really hurtful to know that. Like, I understand that some of those conversations are going to take place, but, sorry, it feels a little unsportsmanlike when people don't approach me about it directly. I completely agree.
Or when assumptions are made when we've had one conversation.
Right.
And then a year and a half later, it comes out that they aren't talking to me anymore because I don't go to church because I hate all Mormons. Well, that's absolutely untrue. And rather than tell me that their feelings are hurt, they've told 7 of my sisters or whatever.
I think along those same lines, for those who have family members who have doubts about the church and who perhaps have even stopped attending church, a thing to remember is that particular thing is their story to tell. It's not really your prerogative.
Meaning the apostate story to tell?
Yeah, it's the apostate story to tell. And so it's not really your prerogative to tell people that they may not have told yet.
Right. It always upsets me when I specifically say, please do not tell these people, let me tell them in my own time. And then I find out they already know. That's a little bit frustrating,
Definitely. So what was your next piece?
What Amber was saying kind of leads into the next piece of advice I was going to give, which is don't let your fears and anxieties control your relationship with the apostate. Many times I've had family members who respond to me with fear and anxiety, like they start to build up this image in their mind of who I am, and it's very different from who I really am. So they start to be afraid of, this is the person that I'm afraid that my daughter or my sibling has become, as opposed to who I actually am. That's a little bit difficult too, and that has to do with exactly what Amber was saying earlier, which is if you would just come talk to me, you could find out that I don't do drugs, and I don't,
get drunk every night.
Yeah, and I don't, hang out with anti-Mormon groups that just get together and talk about how they can tear down the church and things like that. But it's better to approach me and talk to me about, here's what I'm afraid of. Is this really happening? So that I can say, oh, no, that's not happening at all.
Well, another way I think that fears and anxieties about the consequences that you believe in happening to the apostate is that it can ruin every interaction you ever have with that family member. I mean, the tension between my sister and my parents, I mean, you can cut it with a knife. If the only thing you ever think about every time you're around that person is that they're going to hell or they're messing up their lives in this way, I mean, it makes getting together really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I experience something that I call ego depletion every time that I talk with my family members, which is it's a phenomenon where you are working so hard to suppress your own emotions and your own impulse to say something that would be potentially upsetting. And after a while, you just feel exhausted, and it becomes more and more difficult to do unless you can take a break or something like that. I experience that sensation quite a bit, where I'm constantly suppressing the desire to criticize what people say, and I'm like, oh no, I'm just gonna be nice and just smile and nod and not make a scene. And and the important thing to keep in mind is that I didn't leave the church to hurt my family members. That's not why I left the church. Like, they don't need to take it personally. For me, it was a Sophie's choice. I had to eventually, like, I couldn't remain in the church and be mentally healthy. It was really causing a tremendous amount of stress to feel like a hypocrite attending church and again, suppressing the critiques that I have about what was said in church. So I did it because I just couldn't handle that anymore. I didn't do it because I wanted to hurt people or hurt family members. So
right. And if a situation could just be de-escalated, if we could just like put all those fears and upset and worry on the back burner, ignore them for a while, and just hang out and play a game or talk about how funny and cute your kids are or something like that, then it would make everything a lot easier for everybody, and it would also re-solidify those family bonds if instead of this heated tension all the time, we could just have peaceful, fun interactions with each other.
Yeah. At the end of the day, your son or daughter or sibling hasn't really changed that much. They're still fundamentally the same person they always were. And you can kind of build on the good times and the happy memories and the things that you've already shared in the past. You don't need to focus on what's different. Focus on what's still the same about your relationship and remember those things.
Exactly.
And I think it's important, too, when you distance yourself because you're afraid of the person or who they are becoming or who you've heard that they are, then all you're doing is not allowing yourself to see that maybe they're different or maybe they can change. And I think it's especially hard because when people first leave the church, a lot of people, they're hurt and they are upset. And unfortunately, family sometimes gets caught in the crossfire of negative things that somebody may say about the church, which offends the believer because you're attacking something that's precious and dear to them. But then on the opposite hand, like the apostate is like, I just want to be who I am, and who I am hates the church, which I think with most people that gradually changes over time. And
yeah,
if you
I agree.
distance yourself because of that, you'll never see that change, and you can't still love this person because you've decided in their most painful portion of their life that you don't love them, or that you're afraid to love them, I guess is probably more accurate. So if you unfriend that family member because they're constantly hurting your feelings about what they say about the church, so you unfriend them on Facebook so that they never see positive interaction from you either, then it's just going to create a larger distance. So one of my things that I think is super important is to learn how to use filters, basically. So if your apostate family member is posting negative things about Boyd K. Packer on Facebook and you see it, or you see them commenting on other people's statuses that you feel inappropriate, rather than unfriending them or blocking them, simply hide their statuses, hide their comments and their likes, hide what you need to hide to filter them in such a way that you're not offended, and then it'll make everybody's lives a little happier. And then when you see them in person, show them that you love them and are willing to listen, but then to a certain point, be like, can we talk about something else? Don't shut down every conversation and then complain that you don't know them anymore either. It's kind of like this push, this give and take that I feel like is normal in normal life. But then as soon as it becomes about the church, instead of being like, dude, do we have to talk about running anymore? I'm so tired of talking about running. Like, you can't say that. Instead it's like, do I have to talk about your home evening lesson? I don't want to listen to that. Is it the same in exchange as, I don't want to hear how many wives Joseph Smith had anymore. I'm tired of talking about that. Like it's both. Like, I think the family members that are still faithful need to realize just how much they do talk about church stuff, like when it relates to every single aspect of their lives. In the same way that apostates need to look at, they need to filter the information about how much they talk about church stuff too. And instead find different common ground.
Well, and
running. I don't know.
I think that you're totally right. There are things that people can do instead of escalating the situation and making relationships more tension-filled. There are ways you can use social media, and there are boundaries you can put up in real life that make things easier. So apostates can start using their own filters where they block certain posts from believing family members so they don't have to hurt their feelings. And believers, instead of blocking people from Facebook and unfriending them, they can just remove them from their news feed. And then in real life, everybody needs to learn to put up boundaries and say, this is what we want to focus on. That's something that's off limits. Because, everybody does that in their life already. It's just for some reason uncomfortable for religion. I mean...
Well, I know the weird thing is, I don't really think all that much about Mormonism or religion all that much anymore. It's not central to my life. It's only when I engage in family members that, all those emotions come back up. Otherwise, it wouldn't really be... I'm kind of past the angry phase and past the phase where I'm obsessive about it, and I'm ready to move on, and I can't wait till they move on too.
So what's your third piece of advice?
My third piece of advice would be to really try to do unconditional love as opposed to tough love. I've sometimes had family members who, again, this is very human, very normal to have this response when somebody does something that upsets you. The Kubler-Ross stages of grief, one of the stages of grief is anger. Sometimes people strike out in anger when you do something that upsets them, that is traumatic for them. So, I've had family members who have struck out in anger against me, and it's been very painful at times. And again, it's understandable that they have those emotions, but I would be cautious about expressing it directly to the person who's made you angry, because it can erode trust. When a particular family member strikes out in anger and then says, why don't you ever call me? Why don't you ever talk to me? Well, it's because I'm afraid you're going to get mad at me again. I get, it's just exhausting to have to deal with that anger all the time. And I think it'd just be easier if we could focus on love. And, I love them in spite of their religious beliefs. I would hope to expect the same in return,
Right.
On that note, when I was growing up, my mom and dad were both converts. And my dad's family had also converted to the church, but my mom's family never did. They were Presbyterian their entire lives until the day they died and then were baptized. But they never treated us differently. So my grandparents had two daughters who both had children, and we were always treated with the same love and respect as my cousins were. My grandparents visited us just as much. They sent presents, they sent birthday cards, we talked on the phone. My mom was loved and adored for who she was, even if they didn't understand the Mormon component of it. And at one point, I got into an argument with my cousin, and I was probably 9 and she was 11 or something like that, about whose church was more right, as kids will do and should be discouraged from doing. And my grandmother overheard us arguing because we were at her house, and she said, in this family, we don't talk about religion, we just love each other. End of story. The older that I've gotten, the more, and especially through this transition, I try to incorporate that into my life. I don't need to talk about religion. I just need to love my family. And I hope that can come back in the same direction. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't in either way. But I think that's important, just to, you just love each other. And that's all there is.
I think that ultimately that's kind of the approach that my family has taken. Where, we say that, they're just passive and they don't want to address the issue, but I like to think that they're just actively trying to not discuss it because they want to show this unconditional love.
Well, some siblings will just say, just how you doing? They'll just ask, how are things going with the church? But it's very non-judgmental, and it's just, well, I just want to remind you I love you, It's kind of nice,
I think often that family members will try to use that tough love approach out of a fearful hope that they can get people to come back, which is understandable. But I guess my advice would be, if somebody's trying to do that with their child or their sibling, my advice would be that you might be successful in the short term, depending on how vital those family relationships are to that apostate and how fragile they're feeling about life or whatever. You might in the short term be able to guilt them or tough love them back into the church, but it most likely won't last. And you should want somebody to be making decisions on in their life based on how they really truly feel and their own set of morals and understandings rather than guilt and fear. By and large, it won't, at least from the experiences I've seen people have, it doesn't work anyway. All it does is create hard feelings.
Yeah. Again, everybody needs to find a good, healthy outlet for those very real emotions like anger and fear and depression. But I don't think that striking out is the best way to do it. I think that maybe, again, I don't believe in prayer, but prayer can be a good way to do that for a believer. Talking to a bishop can be a good way to do that. Or my preferred method, which is to talk to a therapist, that can also be a good way to do that. There are good, healthy, appropriate forums to express your fears and your angers and your emotion. But I don't think that writing an angry letter or email having an angry phone call is necessarily productive.
Agreed.
So. There's an LA Times article I read earlier, it was either yesterday or today, that I thought was really, and it's specifically talking about grief and how to deal about grief, and it's like this, it looks like a bullseye almost, and whoever's the afflicted one, who's ever the one who the grief has hurt the most. So if you have cancer, you're in the center of the circle. If you are the one leaving the church, you are in the center of the circle. And then the circles go out in diameter according to your relationship with the person. And I am not expressing this correctly. But so when somebody leaves the church, it's about them. It's not about you, even though you may be affected. Mm-hmm. And it's not about their mom or their grandma or their, brother. Even though it affects all of those people, the person is about as the person at the center. And if the family members remember that this is not easy. This is so hard. This is the hardest thing that most people that I've talked to that have left the church, they'll say leaving the church was one of the hardest things they've ever done in their lives, and that it's painful and that it's difficult. And so if you treat that person as if they are in that pain, if you acknowledge the pain and the difficulty, you acknowledge that this is a hard situation, and then you just extend love. Like, love goes in, and then you go vent somewhere else. You find a private board somewhere in the corner of the internet for family members of apostates or whatever. You find what you need to find, and you get that anger and that hurt out somewhere else instead of pushing it inwards to the person who's really struggling. Even if it is hard for you, you have to remember it's harder for them in so many ways. I would have a different message to apostates, but my message to families of apostates is remember that the person is hurting and it's difficult and it's hard, and just love them. And then when they get through this mess of a thing, you'll still have that relationship, which is really should be the end goal. It should be to have a relationship.
And I think it would also be helpful to remember that a person's salvation is between them and, according to the Mormon doctrine, according to what believers believe, someone's salvation is between them and God. So, like Elisa was saying, prayer, if you can take that frame of mind and realize that I should put this burden on God, you know what I mean? It's something that my child or my sibling has to deal with. It's not my issue to hash out. That could also maybe make it easier for you to be loving towards the person rather than upset and angry.
Yeah.
What's your number 4?
All right. So my number 4 is that if you do decide to take the method of trying to influence the apostate family member, as some of my family members have tried to do, I would say that generally it's a better idea to try to engage in a dialogue, meaning a two-way conversation, than a lecture or an ultimatum. Mm-hmm. I think it's really good to listen, and to share feelings, if you can do it without making it a one-way, like, I'm going to tell you what you're going to do with your life now. And some of my family members are better at doing that than others. But yeah, I get a little frustrated with ultimatums sometimes, because I'm like, well, can I at least respond to that? Can I give you my perspective? So, yeah.
I completely agree with what you're saying there. And I think that something that believers should try to remember is that the more the person that you're trying to communicate with feels validated and understood, the more likely they are to listen to what you have to say. So if you repeatedly shut them down and refuse to validate their experience, even if you don't agree with it, the more you're putting up their defenses, the more you're giving them the motivation to withdraw and shut down and be defensive rather than be open and listen to what you have to say.
And just because you listen to somebody doesn't mean you agree with them.
Right.
It doesn't mean your opinion has changed. It just means you're just giving them a voice, which is what I think most really, like, especially in the first part of your leaving the church, people really just want. They just want to be heard. They don't necessarily even care about being agreed with. They just want to be heard. I know I did.
And I can say just for myself personally that if somebody were to say, so what I'm hearing you say is, and while I don't agree with it, I can understand why it would be painful for you to be going through this, I would be much more willing to let them go on their little religious ramble that won't convince me of anything, but my hackles won't go up, you know?
Yeah.
Rather than being shut down.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think one of the more difficult things about the situation is that oftentimes those who are in the church never had a chance to learn what it's like to be a parent for an adult child.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the cynical person might say that it's because the church treats everyone like children, and so that's the only example that they have. But I think that trying to treat your children, even though they're your children, treat them like adults and interact with them as you would one of your peers or someone that you respected. That's definitely, rather than doing these demands or ultimatums or lectures, actually try to have a dialogue with them in a conversation like an adult.
Agreed.
And I think when as far as we're talking about ultimatums too, we need to touch on spouses of the apostate or doubting member. Be careful about laying out ultimatums. I know spouses, it's painful. It's hard to watch. It's a difficult situation for everybody involved. Instead of saying, well, I can love you as long as this doesn't happen, or I can love you as long as this doesn't happen. Instead, just it's that unconditional love again. This is hard, this is difficult, and I love you.
Yeah.
Not, I'll love you, but no, never drink alcohol ever, or our marriage is over. Or I love you, but as long as you at least remain Christian, because if you become an atheist, we just cannot have a relationship. Instead, just say, I love you, period.
Yeah.
And I think that's
and we'll work through it.
And we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
We'll get some professional help. Please do. I can't emphasize enough the unconditional love that a spouse of the person who's going through this has or should have.
Yeah.
Even though apostates are hard people to love sometimes, I can admit that.
Yeah.
So
when I was running Voices, I tried really hard to find interfaith couples who would come on to discuss their story, and it was very hard. I couldn't find anybody who would be willing to do that. But I definitely think it's a topic that needs to be addressed, and maybe it's something I should get back on the bandwagon and try to find couples who'd be willing to come on and talk about those sorts of things. Because you're right, there's a lot of stuff there that could be discussed and might be helpful to people.
But again, this is not, we left the church together, so we're not speaking to our experience, but I have known a few people anecdotally who feel that once they worked through their issues, where one was a believer and the other one wasn't, it did make their marriage stronger in the end, because they really discovered what they had to love each other for outside of the church. They had something else in common that binded them together. So
Definitely. How about number 5?
Okay, number 5, my last piece is that good fences make good neighbors. It's a quote from a delightful poem by Robert Frost. And I really like the tension in that particular poem. It starts with the idea of something there is that doesn't love a wall. It's not the ideal situation to have to put up a couple of fences here and there. But I think it's healthy and normal for people to kind of develop a couple of boundaries and say, here's a boundary. Let's maybe, will you please respect this? I don't want to talk about this issue and this issue. And I would really appreciate it if you would respect that. And you're welcome to draw a couple of boundaries yourself. It's difficult because I feel like in the church, we're not always taught to keep boundaries. We're told to share everything, to bear our testimony, to, tell everything to your bishop, to let your parents know everything about you, to have your life be an open book, especially you have nothing to hide. And so it's a very strange experience leaving the church to start building those. Here's boundaries of things that I will and will not share with other people. But I would say it's a good idea to just kind of, when somebody says, here's a boundary, will you please respect that? To do your best to respect it.
I'm trying really hard to do that with my family. And the boundary I'm putting up is I don't want to discuss religion. I don't want to fight. I don't want to have a tension-filled relationship. Let's just enjoy each other's company. So far it's worked, but it hasn't really been tested all that much. So in theory, I completely agree.
Well, and keep in mind they can be negotiated.
Yeah.
You know, somebody can say, well, I'm not comfortable with that boundary for these reasons, you know, it helps me to talk about this because of that. But, you know, as long as you build the boundaries together, I think that can be good. But, you know, sometimes I feel like my relationship with my family members is like the ending scene in War Games, that 1984 film, I think, in which there's this computer playing out all these nuclear war options, and suddenly the computer realizes that there is no good option.
No, you're going to have to retell it.
Oh, right? So, you do it.
Okay, so there's a computer who has gotten control of the thermonuclear weapons of the world and is going to start a war. And so to teach the computer the futility of war, they have it play tic-tac-toe against itself. And tic-tac-toe is a game in which you just keep playing and you can always bring it to a draw. And so in the end, the computer says, well, this is a silly game, a pointless game. It's the solution is not to play.
Yeah. That's true. And sometimes I feel that way, like my family members constantly want to talk about religion. And I just feel like, well, I can talk about this with you, but I don't think either of us is going to change our mind. Or the end result is that we'll probably just make each other upset. So I think it would be easier if we maybe don't talk about it as much as maybe you'd like to talk about it. But it maybe on occasion, you know, we can have a respectful discussion about it, possibly. But sometimes it just feels like it would be easier if we would just say, well, let's just let it be the elephant in the room. And maybe every once in a while we could mention that elephant in the room in a, you know, loving, joking way, perhaps when we get to that point in our relationship. But for now, I just feel like, oh, a fence would be so nice right now, just so we don't have to talk about this all the time.
Right. Go ahead.
Do you think there's an arc of acceptability of talking about it? Like when it very first happens, everyone wants to discuss it and get it out. And then maybe like it comes to a peak and then maybe, okay, we're all in a good place. And then it kind of goes away. Because I think there are appropriate times to discuss it with your family.
Yeah.
I guess it depends on your own family relationships and such. But if it never gets talked about ever, I think that can be just as hard as talking about it all the time. But again, it completely depends on your relationship within your family and your family dynamic.
I completely agree. Yeah. And it's hard to say. We've only been out of the church for about a year and a half. So, you know, we might not have reached that comfortable equilibrium where everybody's cool with it, you know, and we can talk about it without getting upset. But yeah, I look forward to that day.
I know in my family, it seems like just as I was getting to the point where I didn't need to talk about it anymore, then my sister left the church and her family. So then it was this huge uproar again, and everybody was mad at me because obviously it was my fault and they don't have brains of their own. And then as soon as that's kind of weighing down, now another sister's doing the same thing. And so it's just kind of like one of those things. It feels like it will never go away. So be willing to listen and engage and have a conversation, I think, is important. I can't state that enough. But at the same time, know when not to have a conversation too. But don't be afraid.
For me, I just get tired of it being 100% all the time.
Oh, yeah.
You know, for a year and a half now, I'm just like, can we just not talk about this one time? You know? So
maybe if they had respected that the decision you made was a well thought out decision, that it's not something you came upon lightly and thought, well, I'm going to stop going to church now. And they could accept that that you were making a decision that was an important thing to you. It wasn't like a flippant, we decided to go to church isn't true. And they could accept that as a decision that you made, and they can stop trying to convince you the other way. Or like, is it a convincing discussion, I guess is what I'm asking.
I don't know.
Like
it's hard for that, because in order for them to acknowledge that the decision that you made had at least some measure of validity would mean that it's possible that the church isn't true. And that's a hard thing for them to even, admit as a premise.
But family could, instead of assuming the worst, because the thing that has upset me the most about leaving the church is watching how, and it happens to almost everybody, you know, you're a trusted, respected individual, and as soon as you make this one decision, all of a sudden everything you do is suspect. You might not have any morality whatsoever. I can't trust you. Everything you say is a lie. I'm scared of you type of stuff. It would probably be really helpful, even if you can't admit on any level or acknowledge on any level that the decision that your family member is making has some weight behind it. You can at least assume good things from them rather than bad things.
Yeah.
Assume that this is a tough decision that they're making. Assume that they didn't come to it lightly. And even though you think they're wrong and misinformed or whatever, that they're not lazy, that they're not cheating on their spouse, that they're not doing all these things that the worst fear in you brings out and makes you think is the cause behind why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yes. Even line it up with politics a little bit. You know, they may have decided to vote for, you know, the opposite party that you would have voted for, but you don't have to assume that they did it out of laziness or they did it out of apathy or they did it because they're deluded. Mm-hmm. You can assume that you can disagree, but still vote for different people. And it's the same with religion. You can assume, you can say, well, I disagree, but I don't think that you're doing it because of any nefarious reasons. It's just because we disagree, and that's okay, even if you're wrong.
Mm-hmm. Well, did we cover it all? Does anybody have anything else they want to throw out there?
Love, 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 love. On both sides of the issue. Your family.
Yeah, the Beatles, all you need is love. No.
All right, well, thanks for joining me on this last segment, and I hope everybody has enjoyed this episode of the Mormon Expositor, and we'll talk to you again, as Brant says, after a while.
When I gave my heart to you, I swore it would only be for you, but I said that before you broke my heart. When the feelings you feel of you, I can't share mine with you. The lump of pain in my throat won't let me start, and I wish that I didn't ignore. The broken hearts get broken more. Sometimes in our lives we learn things done come back in turn. What did I do to earn nothing from you? In life, the mistakes I've had don't do me any bad till I can't handle sad things I've been through. I could learn from mistakes and from sins, but I make them again and again. Above the oceans of tears that I've cried, to look down on myself and ask why. For you I won't change me again. said, wear clothes like this. I said, okay. I've been stomped in the ground, molded and twisted round so long before I found I'm not just clay. I'm worried what others might see. Instead of seeking approval from me, I wanna fly so fast that my past passes by, to erase all my past one last tries. If it's true that I'm such a great guy, why can't I look me in the eyes? I want to begin to think of me the way that I am, to forget all the people I've been. I've figured out reasons for why. Now I'll just give me one more last try.